Modern prisons can be a living hell, but probably to nobody's surprise, they used to be a whole lot worse. From draconian law codes to brutal executions, this is what life was like for prisoners in ancient Rome. During the early periods of Roman history, prisons as we know them actually didn't exist. Instead, prisoners were kept in holding cells until their trial or punishment. Execution was a common punishment, especially for the lower classes, where criminals convicted of less serious crimes may have had to pay fines or serve as slave labor. Later, in the Imperial Age, actual imprisonment became more common, though this originally happened unintentionally as a result of mass overcrowding before trials. Roman officials, law experts, and even emperors condemned imprisonment as inhumane, including the 3rd century jurist Ulpian, who wrote, "Prison indeed ought to be employed for confining men, not for punishing them." In the reign of Hadrian, provincial governors were forbidden from confining anyone for life, regardless of the crime. In particular, the Emperor Antoninus must have despised the idea of imprisonment, having once said, "Your statement that a free man has been condemned to imprisonment in chains for life is incredible, for this penalty can scarcely be imposed even upon a person of servile condition." Known as the 12 Tables, the first written Roman law code was issued in 451 BC. It lists several serious offenses and the harsh consequences for those convicted. Condemned prisoners faced all sorts of horrific capital punishments, sometimes very similar to the crime itself, such as the burning of arsonists. Other gruesome punishments included decapitation, hanging, clubbing, or being thrown off the Tarpeian rock. There was also a law specifically for the Vestal Virgins, priestesses of the Roman goddess of the hearth, Vesta. If they failed to remain chaste, they were condemned to be buried alive. By far the strangest and scariest of these earliest punishments was the Kalleus, a nightmarishly created punishment for the killers of close relatives. The convicted person was placed in a sack with an ape, a dog, and a serpent, which was then sealed and tossed into the sea. Points for creativity there, not so much for humanity. Although jail conditions were often brutal for the poorest Roman citizens, the wealthiest Romans were rarely imprisoned. Instead, they were usually put under house arrest while they awaited trial. Moreover, voluntary exile was a readily available option to prominent aristocrats. It might sound like an obvious choice to take exile over execution, but exile came with its own dangers and hardships too. Even the most powerful Romans lost their citizenship and all their immovable wealth. Even worse, if they made the foolish decision to return to Rome, any other citizen was free to kill them on sight. By the 1st century AD, two main types of exile for upper-class citizens had been established. During the Republic, wealthy Romans had only been forced to stay away from certain places, such as the city of Rome itself. By this point, however, a new, harsher form of exile had emerged, forcing each exiled Roman to live in one specific and highly undesirable location. This was the worst punishment for the wealthy in the early Imperial Age, unless the crime was particularly vile, of course, in which case, well, you know.
Off with his head!
The male heads of Roman households, known as Paterfamilias, had unlimited power over the entire family, and this even included the right to imprison family members as a punishment. Cells were set up inside family homes, some being as small as a closet and others being large enough to confine several people. Forced confinement was most often used to punish slaves, meaning villas often had designated areas for slaves to be shackled to. There were also places where slaves were held but given a little more freedom, as well as special areas for well-behaved slaves. It was fully within the father's rights to confine any family member to maintain discipline, no matter how minor said misbehavior may have been. This meant that, hypothetically, an elderly noble father had the power to imprison his son, no matter how wealthy, powerful, or influential. The Romans' first real prison was also its most notorious, with an ancient history stretching back to the 4th king of the city of Rome. In the 7th century BC, Ancus Marcius began the construction of a subterranean structure at the foot of the Capitoline Hill. The site was originally a cistern for a spring beneath the floor before it was converted into the now infamous prison cell. This small, horrifying dungeon served as either an execution chamber or a place where prisoners were confined and left to die of starvation. One of Marcius' successors later covered up the dungeon except for a tiny hole for an entrance, making it even darker and more terrifying. The nearly pitch-black chamber is 22 feet wide and 30 feet long, with walls of just over 6 feet high, and it's located more than 12 feet underground. By the 3rd century BC, the prison was known as the Tullianum. The Roman historian Sallust said of the dungeon, "Its appearance is disgusting and vile by reason of the filth, the darkness, and the stench." In the late 2nd century BC, a far less ghastly cell was added above the Tullianum to give prisoners slightly better conditions during their confinement, including light from a small window. By the Middle Ages, the entire complex was known as the Mamertine Prison. Today, it is a site of worship for Christians, since the original cell was supposedly inhabited by both St. Peter and St. Paul. In addition to household cells and the brief confinement prisoners endured before punishment, there was one other kind of Roman prison, those owned and operated by private creditors. Known as Carcer privatus, these private prisons were used to hold citizens who failed or refused to pay their debts. In fact, imprisonment is only mentioned in the 12 tables when referring to laws about debt. Debtors could be imprisoned for up to 60 days if they were unable or unwilling to pay. Then, after their debt was announced publicly for 3 market days in a row, if the situation remained the same, debtors were either sold into slavery or executed. The wealthy took advantage of these private prisons during the 1st century BC when Rome was fraught with civil war and instability. They targeted poverty-stricken farmers or even innocent travelers and forced them into labor on their massive estates.
Help! Help! I'm being repressed!
The lesser magistrates, known as the nocturni, served as an early type of police force in ancient Roman society. These officials had the authority to temporarily imprison citizens for disobeying their commands or for breaching public disorder. There was also another option more suitable to confining larger groups of people. By the 2nd century BC, a former quarry located at the Capitoline Hill had been converted into a kind of early prison camp, which was often used to hold prisoners of war but also held some citizens. These caves held a large number of low-value prisoners who were overseen by just a handful of guards. All in all, it wasn't considered a huge deal if a few prisoners managed to escape every now and then. Conditions in these caves certainly weren't ideal, but they were better than the Tullianum since prisoners were actually fed and not just left to die. Then again, some prisoners were starved just enough to resort to cannibalism. Some things weren't exactly hunky-dory down there. As Roman society became more sophisticated and the legal system evolved, more citizens went to court and needed to be contained before their cases were addressed, so more prisons were built to hold them. By the 2nd century AD, the increasing number of prisons in Rome led to the satirist Juvenal to write about how he longed for the good old days when the city only needed the one. But even though more prisons had been built, the legal system simply couldn't keep up with the rising number of cases. As a result, prisoners were confined for longer periods than was intended, especially among the poor. To deal with the issue, the Romans passed a law limiting the amount of time that a person could be imprisoned to 1 year. One exception to these rules, however, were those labeled insane or mentally handicapped, who were often confined for life. Although public prisons were on the rise through the latter days of the Roman Republic, the demise of private prisons wasn't to occur until the Imperial Age. Nonetheless, there were some early signs that the people hated the practice of confining people for their debts. In 385 BC, the war hero Marcus Manlius became even more popular when he tried to release a group of imprisoned debtors, but the attempt failed and Manlius was imprisoned before being executed. After the fall of the Republic, the early Roman emperors needed to consolidate their power, and so private prisons were increasingly viewed as existing outside the law. In this new era, those who were caught running such prisons were themselves imprisoned in public prisons for as long as they had held others. If there had been many prisoners, the creditors had to be imprisoned for as long as all of them combined. On top of all that, all the debts they were owed from their captives were erased. But those weren't the only consequences one could face for running a private prison. Some creditors were tried and convicted of treason too, which ultimately led to their execution. Hoping to demonstrate their power and deter crimes through horrific spectacles, the emperors greatly stepped up executions as a method of punishment in Rome. Specifically, those guilty of treason, murder, sexual assault, adultery, sorcery, and desecrating the dead were liable to be executed. The executions themselves, known as the highest punishments, included crucifixion, burning, and being thrown to the beasts. They were usually public events and often took place in arenas.
Stabbed? Takes a second. Crucifixion lasts hours. It's a slow, horrible death.
Well, at least it gets you out in the open air.
The highest punishments were first used early in the Imperial Age, but reached an obscene level during the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. This period was so brutal that even the wealthy could be tortured and publicly executed via these methods. As the empire grew, Rome's overcrowded prisons had to deal not only with more criminal cases, but also with a growing number of Rome's enemies. Christians, traitors, and rebels were not the only ones who received the highest punishments, but they usually endured the harshest conditions and worst tortures, since they were so despised by the state. Imprisonment wasn't usually part of the official sentence, but some Christians endured long periods of confinement before their official punishment took place. However, some Christians had a slightly better experience in prison than many because they could entertain regular visitors. In Christian doctrine, Jesus claims that those who visited prisoners could be counted among the righteous at the Last Judgment. As such, when Rome began persecuting Christian believers in the 2nd century AD, many free Christians would regularly visit them in prison. By the 3rd century AD, conditions in prisons had become so terrible that later Christian emperors tried earnestly to reverse the trend. From the reign of Constantine the Great onwards, the worst aspects of Roman criminal law were gradually removed, until the legal system resembled that of the early empire. As Christianity became more popular throughout the empire, it began to affect the way people thought of both prisoners and prisons. Most notably, early Christian views promoted charity and suggested less severe punishments for fellow members of the church. By the 4th century AD, however, pretty much the entire empire had become Christian, making this concept difficult to enforce as official policy. Nonetheless, it's safe to say that the growing influence of Christianity had a profound impact on crime and punishment in the late days of the Roman Empire. Check out one of our newest videos right here. Plus, even more grunge videos about your favorite stuff are coming soon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single one.